So with the role that I do, I spend my life either looking at creds, putting together creds, thinking about whether we should put forward creds, or just generally having creds type conversations with lots and lots of brands. And obviously there's a lot of value in it from brand side, a lot of value in it from our side. I would say that there's a whole different episode on creds and whether they still have the same value, whether you should include them in pitches and whatnot, because we've battled with that idea in the past, but let's park that and just assume that creds are the status quo and everyone sort of sees the value in them. But particularly for the purposes of today, I think both of us separately and together have talked about this, that we've noticed a bit of a shift in terms of the focus of creds type questions that we're getting from prospective clients. So I know in the last, I'm going to say 3-4 months, we've had several different pitches, and there's a common theme that's come up, and I know it's probably representative of the times that we're currently in, but particularly the questions have centred and floated around our stability as an agency, and I think we've identified that that's coming in 2-3 different forms. So I know quite recently we've been asked several times about our financial stability as an agency, not least just yesterday in a pitch. The founder of said brand was quite glowing, which is nice to hear, but also quite inquisitive about our growth whilst remaining financially secure as well. And then the second sort of side of stability, I think, comes out of the team, the infrastructure, and I guess low staff and or client turnover. So they're the sort of topics that we want to focus on today. My first question for you is, have you seen a notable change in terms of the questions that we're being asked? Just be mindful that the dog needs to leave the room, so I'm going to let him out. Over to you, Lee.
He also might not want to leave.
Hello, bud. Are you getting in? I would largely agree with that, and I think the way that you identified it at the start with the recent times, last 3 years, I think a lot of agencies folded through COVID, and a lot of agencies are probably still recovering from it. Validating an agency on commercials, I think, is relevant, but only to the point where you can take that information that's publicly available with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, company's house type stuff.
Yeah, but it is valid. I think staff retention and I think growth through adversity is a good measure for a long-term prospective relationship.
Yeah.
And I can see the value in it. I mean, there's a lot of agencies, like I think 7,500, 8,000 digital agencies in the UK. How are you supposed to validate any of them?
I guess it's due diligence, isn't it? We do it. We run it on as we're heading into a potential first conversation with a potential new client. So it's just happening in the reverse, and I think we'd want to onboard and work with a brand who is diligent in taking that care and sort of outside looking in. Way back at the sort of start of your pitching career, so obviously pre-Flaunt, do you remember facing similar questions? Because I mean, I'm talking 5 to 10 years ago in my career. I can't remember having these sorts of questions.
I never really came across it in the previous agencies, but I guess where it would have probably come up would have been almost off camera in the procurement situation, whereas now I think people are more savvy with what information is freely available. So that question is less of a taboo.
Yeah. I also wonder whether it was more, if it ever came up previously compared to, let's say, a carbon copy conversation coming up today, whether previously it was more of a tick box, whereas now it's actually intrigue. Mm-hmm. It's almost in parallel with, like we had yesterday, talking through the story of where we've come from. It's that sort of, it's almost the softer, fluffier stuff to some extent, but I don't mean that with any negative connotations at all. I think it's going hand in hand with, you know, talk me through where you've come from and whatnot. And I do think it's not just, as I say, a tick box. I wonder if it's trying to find a match from an ambitions perspective. We've gone through the same, we've, you know, walked the same paths as you.
I think that's the right way of using that information from the client's side, though. Like taking the story out of that information, looking at the growth, look at how the business has invested in themselves, look at the headcount growth, what that trajectory looks like, if that trajectory is going to continue. That then can validate certain elements of if that's going to be a long-term relationship or not. And I think last 3 years, shaky ground, big time.
Yeah.
So you've got to do something. You've got to try and do something. And I think if it continues to keep cropping up like it is, we will probably look to give that information up front in more of a structured way.
That's what I was going to ask you, because if it's coming up outside looking in, as we've mentioned, Company's House, take it with a pinch of salt and whatnot, but if it's coming up as regularly as it is, which I'd almost say it's more than 1 in 2 conversations we're being asked these questions, and again, it's valid. What can we do to preempt it, help it, or whatnot? Is there something that we can do? Have you ever thought about getting on their side of the table at that stage as much as we can?
I think it depends on the business, doesn't it? It's more important to some businesses than others, and I think the one advantage of us maybe getting in front of it is the narrative, being able to shape the story a little bit and trying to highlight the important bits rather than it just being black and white. And I think that context is where we could probably leverage it slightly.
And I think added to what we're talking about in terms of what we're finding spilling into creds level conversations is that story. I think you're setting people up with a little bit more of the transactional stuff, but adding the story and the, as I keep saying, fluffier, but not with the negative connotations that it might previously have had. I think throughout all of this as well, not least obviously from a commercial perspective, you need to, the black and white stuff needs to be sort of boxed off, but it also feels like we're getting stronger and stronger from both sides, agency and brand, towards like that values match partnership. Mm-hmm. That's where I feel like there's some real strength has sort of come about, and maybe it is the times that we're in that has forced people's hands. I also think people are going to, brand marketers are going to be getting pressure from those above them to make the right decisions in terms of stability financially, because it's so rocky at the moment. But that values thing is an interesting one. I feel like we're talking about it a lot more as well, aren't we, in those introductory conversations, and extracting that out of the brands themselves as well.
Yeah, I think the comfort level of the agency being interrogated about that is a good indicator, because when it comes to transparency, you can't, although I would still state taking the data that's available online with a pinch of salt, it's still black and white, it's still filed accounts, and you can't manipulate that data to a large extent. And when you've got agencies that aren't transparent and that aren't value-led and that aren't great, which also happens, they will tell the story that they want to tell and shape the narrative in the hope of winning that business and winning that client in a manipulative way. And I think that's where the value is in that. It's gone that way, and it will continue to go that way. And that level of information, clients are privy to it.
Yeah.
And I think they're becoming a lot more comfortable asking what questions they feel they need to ask for them, rather than it just being, well, you come and pitch to us. It's, we want to have a meeting, we want to know X, Y, and Z. And I think that is shifting as well.
It's refreshing to be on the receiving end of that.
Yeah.
To be questioned like that. It was interesting yesterday with the lady that we met. She effectively, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but the message that at one point of our conversation was, she met with several agencies over a years, and fair play to her for saying this. She said, you all sound the same outside, on the surface, lots of the same sort of messages and whatnot. And to be fair to brands, what did you start off this conversation by saying? How many thousands and thousands of digital agencies there are?
Yep.
It must be tough to be on the receiving end of pretty much monotony in terms of the same messages that you're getting sent. So fair play, company's house, pinch of salt, but it is a good sort of line in the sand, I guess, and barometer for comparison. At least it's relative. You can use it as a relative measure, one versus agency A versus agency B, for example. But yeah, I found that interesting. Have you heard that before? All agencies sound the same, and you're all painting the same sort of message, and it is tough to be in that. I mean, Polly will mention it from a marketing and brand perspective as well. It is hard, isn't it, to
differentiate. I think one thing, drawing on that experience and using that meeting that we were in as an example, there was times through that meeting where there were questions being asked of services that would sort of lean into an agency setup, branding, things like that as a specialism, that we clearly at that point said no.
Yeah.
We don't do that. We knock that back there and then.
Yeah.
And I think that narrative of knowing where our service specialisms sit and how we responded to that on the spot is how you differentiate. And I think that resonated with the audience in the room.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm sure you'll be thinking similar. I think we can all identify places we've been previously or seen where that question would be answered completely dishonestly, just to come across in what they think is the right way. But actually, I think the right way completely now as well feels like honesty, transparency, doing the right thing. I sat there and it's almost a proud moment to be able to answer that. And it shouldn't be a feeling, should it? You're just answering a question totally honestly, but we know you almost know what you're up against as well.
From my perspective, building on that, I want you to be sat in those situations and be absolutely fucking pumped.
Yeah.
When somebody asks you a question that would be fired at someone that's looking to sell. Normally, it's one of those, isn't it? And you've seen it written on salespeople's faces. Oh, shit.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I know that the way that we're set up and the transparency and the values that we carry allow you to sit there and be like, fucking ask me. Go on, ask me.
Yeah.
Ask me. Because I know that you're confident in the response.
It's a nice position to be in, because I've been on the wrong side of not being in that position before, and I've seen others be in that position. Generally speaking about creds, there's a bit of a rhetoric in sales world and pitching world that, and as I say, we could go into a whole new episode about this, but final question and thought is, given everything we've just talked about and the rhetoric that exists, which, just to explain it, in sales world, whether creds is even something you should be bothering about, talking about in a pitch scenario. And I get there's certain situations where you might pull away from or completely dilute down your creds. How are you meant to get this sort of level of conversation, the points that we've been discussing across, which I feel are imperative for that, and particularly that values-led partnership that you're trying to forge with a new brand, with another company? How are you meant to get that across if you drop creds altogether? I personally cannot see the dropping creds out of pitch level conversations, new biz, whatever. I just don't see how how you can avoid it.
I don't think that there will ever be a scenario where it's not a conversation of some sort that focuses in on that, because like you say, that going back to the agency count, so many agencies, a lot of which have publicly have crossover in what they're doing, what they're selling, how they communicate, how they look, how they feel. There's going to need to be an additional layer of context to any sort of situation like that. So I don't ever see them not being a necessity. I think the information that is available publicly is playing more of a part, and I think, like I said before, clients are becoming more confident at outlining exactly what is going to tick boxes for them, which helps us, which is a good step forward. I think it's not a generic, we want to see the same old, who have you worked with in the past, X, Y, and Z. We want to see how you treat your staff. We want to see how you've grown. We want to see if you're commercially sound. We want to see how you dedicate your time to supporting your local charities, anything that's important to that business.
I also think, like, critically, if you do your due diligence right before you head into a conversation or a pitch with a brand, you can feasibly and on valid grounds tailor your creds, section and message perfectly to them from the information that you've, ascertained in your research sort of stage of your process. So, for example, if they're a family-run business or, big on supporting local community, we're fortunate enough to be able to pick and choose from our, let's say, creds deck and the information that we have about us, so as to not just bombard someone blanket with everything about our agency and all the awards we've won. We haven't won any awards, we haven't entered any. But that tailoring on valid grounds, not making stuff up and pulling stuff out of your ass, is a great position to be in as well, because you're effectively saying we can do everything service level and whatnot, but actually listen to how we as a agency are set up and the things that we believe in, which we know is a match for you, rather than just saying, listen to us, we're an agency, we're great, and stuff I'm about to say for the next 5-10 minutes might be relevant, might not. Whereas it always feels like where we can get to now, we've got into a position where we're talking through our creds. It's because we've done the research to get to that point that we're more qualified in that conversation. And not only that, then the agency information that we deliver to that client is then more research-based and tailored to them, and still on honest, transparent, valid grounds for them.
Yeah, and I think that's the right approach. That level of detail is where you differentiate. And I remember early on when we first set up, and there were only 2-3 of us, having to draw on past experience at other agencies.
Yeah.
To be able to allow the people that we were speaking to validate whether we were capable. Whereas now, the position that we're at, obviously 8 years in, we've got a long history of delivered work. We've got a long history of successful campaigns. We've got a great team in place.
Yeah.
So we can use our own story, obviously.